They pulled up with a truck and asked her if she wanted it. She said she'd take all of it, every last pound. 3 tons of spent grain steaming in the cold air of Harlan County, Kentucky like a dare the whole county thought she'd lose. Marin Ashcroft crouched at the edge of the pile, her knees pressing into frozen mud, and she scooped a handful of the pale wet mash into her palm. It was still warm from the brewing process. It steamed faintly in the December air. The stuff looked like oatmeal that had given up on life. Soggy, limp, faintly sweet with the ghost of barley and a sour edge that would only get worse the longer it sat. She squeezed it. Water ran between her fingers in a thin, milky stream. 3 tons of this sat in a heap behind the flatbed, and the driver was already unhitching the trailer like he couldn't wait to be rid of it. He looked at her once before he pulled away. A young woman in a weather-tan canvas farm jacket, the darker brown hood pushed back off her neck, a worn red and cream plaid flannel showing at the collar. Her medium brown hair, chestnut where the low light caught it, was pulled back in a loose, low ponytail with several strands falling around her forehead and temples. She had freckles across the bridge of her nose. Her cheeks were flushed pink from the cold. She looked 24 because she was 24. She looked to that driver like somebody's daughter who had wandered into her father's business and gotten confused about which end of the truck she was supposed to be standing at. He smiled the way a man smiles at a dog doing a trick. He climbed back into the cab. The truck pulled away down the gravel drive with a plume of diesel smoke behind it, and it left her there with 3 tons of what everyone in Harlan County would have called garbage. But we need to back up, because 20 minutes ago, Marin didn't know this truck was coming. 20 days ago, she didn't know she'd be standing on this land at all. Corwin Ashcroft died on the 23rd of November, 1991, in the back bedroom of the farmhouse he'd built with his own hands in 1954. He was 72 years old. The cancer had taken 8 months, and it had taken everything except his mind, which had stayed sharp and furious right up until the end. Marin was 24. She was his only grandchild. She had driven down from Lexington, where she'd been working the counter at a farm supply store for $6 an hour, and she had held his hand for the last 3 weeks of his life. She had watched him grow smaller in that bed. She had watched the width of his shoulders reduced to the width of a boy's. She had watched his hands, those big square hands that had planed lumber and shod horses and pulled calves out of laboring cows in weather that would have killed a lesser man. She had watched those hands go thin at the knuckles and pale at the beds of the nails, and she had held them anyway because that was the whole point of being there. He had said one thing to her the night before he died. She had leaned close to hear it. The room was dark except for the small lamp on the nightstand. His voice had been dry and thin, but the words had been clear, and she had known, even in the moment, that she would remember them for the rest of her life. He had said, "Waste, Marin, look for the waste." She had said, "I don't understand." He had said, "You will." Then he had closed his eyes and turned his face a little toward the wall, and he had slept, and in the morning he was gone. She buried him on a Tuesday in the family plot behind the east tree line, where the soil was dark enough that you didn't need a marker to know the ground had been loved. There were maybe 14 people at the graveside. Neighbors, 2 men from the co-op, a pastor who read a passage from Ecclesiastes about there being a season for every purpose under heaven. Marin stood at the head of the grave in her grandfather's canvas jacket that was 2 sizes too big on her, and she did not cry. She had cried out the crying in the 3 weeks she had held his hand. She stood at the grave with her small chin lifted and her light blue-gray eyes fixed on the middle distance. And she listened to the pastor, and when it was done, she thanked everyone by name. And then she went back to the farmhouse, and she sat on the porch step in the cold, and she did not go inside for a long time. What Corwin Ashcroft had left her was this: 240 acres of cattle and hayland that had not turned a real profit in 6 years. 38 head of beef cattle, most of them Angus crosses, standing in a field with their ribs showing more than they should. A farmhouse with a roof that leaked in 2 places. A barn with a workshop so organized it looked like a museum exhibit. And $14,000 in back taxes owed to the county sitting in an envelope on the kitchen table like a goodbye letter from the government. The math was the kind that makes your chest tight. Commercial feed grain was running $186 a ton that winter. Those 38 head needed roughly 6 tons a month to get through to spring. That was better than $1,100 a month just in feed. The yearly gross from cattle sales, if she sold the calves at market weight, if the prices held, if nothing died, if nothing broke, if the weather cooperated for once in its life, would come to maybe $22,000. Subtract the feed, subtract the hay, subtract the back taxes on a payment plan she had not negotiated yet, subtract diesel and vet bills and fencing wire. And what was left was a young woman working herself to death for the privilege of going broke slowly instead of fast. She stood in the kitchen the second morning after the funeral, and she looked at the envelope of back taxes on the table, and she looked at the receipt for the plot marker she still needed to order, and she looked at the frost on the window over the sink, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her, I do not know how to do this. The thought did not scare her. She noticed that it did not scare her. She had thought growing up that she would be scared the day she found herself alone with a problem that big. But she was not scared. She was something else. Something quieter and heavier and more useful than fear. She was ready to work. She just did not know yet what the work was. She found the journal on her third night in the barn workshop, tucked inside her grandfather's leather apron that still hung on its peg by the forge. The apron itself was a thing that stopped her in the doorway. The leather had gone soft and dark with 50 years of work. The straps had been reset twice, and both repairs had been made by hand with copper rivets, and both of those repairs had been made by Corwin himself. She could tell because there was a small notch on the top strap that he had put there when she was 11, so that she would know which side went up when she put it on. She had worn the apron to help him at the anvil that spring. She remembered. She took the apron off the peg. Something rectangular and heavy was tucked into the front pocket. It was a book, battered, leather-covered. The leather was dark with age, cracked along the spine, held shut by a brass clasp that clicked with the specific sound of something built to last. It was the size of her palm. It weighed almost nothing, and it also weighed everything. She sat down on the workbench with the journal in her lap, and she opened it. His handwriting filled it, tight, slanted, the penmanship of a man who had learned to write with a fountain pen and never saw a reason to change. Pages and pages of soil composition notes, rainfall tallies, sketches of root systems, feed ratios, compost temperatures measured with a meat thermometer, notes in the margins on which pasture drained best in a wet spring, a diagram of a beehive weight over 3 seasons, a page for the year 1952 when he had lost half his flock of chickens to a mink, and the entry for that page said only lost 11, rebuilt the coop lower, learned the lesson, and threaded through all of it in different pencils, in different inks, at different points. Across the decades, one idea repeated so many times it was practically a prayer. Waste is just a resource without a destination. He had written it on the first page. He had written it in the margins. He had underlined it twice on a page about chicken manure and wood ash. He had circled it on a page about drainage. The old man had spent 30 years of his life trying to close every loop on this farm, every output becoming an input, every scrap and dropping and fallen leaf cycling back into the soil or the animals or the next season's growth. The neighbors thought he was eccentric. The county extension agent thought he was stubborn. Corwin Ashcroft thought he was right, and he had died before he could prove it. Marin sat on the workbench with the journal open in her lap, and she read for 2 hours by the light of the workshop bulb. Her breath fogged. Her hands went numb. She did not notice. She read the way a person reads a letter from someone they have loved for a very long time and did not know had left them anything. And she came to the last page he had written, dated the 4th of October of that year, 7 weeks before he died. And the entry said only, for Marin, when it is her turn. She closed the journal. She held it flat against her chest for a long minute, and then she put it in the inside left pocket of her canvas jacket, right against the wool of the flannel, and she did not take it out again. She sat on the workbench a long time after that. The workshop was quiet in the way only a workshop can be quiet at night, with the tools all in their places and the anvil cold and the fire in the forge banked to embers. She could see on the shelf above the workbench the small tin can where her grandfather had kept his railroad pencils. 6 of them, sharpened to points that were still sharp. She could see the small notebook where he had kept the weekly tally of egg production before the chickens were sold in '87. She could see on the wall above the anvil a photograph taken in 1961 of Corwin standing next to a Ford tractor with a grin on his face that Marin had never seen on him in life. He was 39 in the photograph. He was younger than her mother had been when her mother died. She had one memory that came back to her sitting there. She was 10 years old. It was late summer. She had come to spend a month with her grandparents on the farm the way she did every summer. And she had gotten it into her head that she was going to help Corwin bring the hay in from the Southfield. He had let her. He had set her up on the flatbed wagon behind the tractor, and he had taught her in one afternoon how to stack the bales in an interlocking pattern so they would not fall in transit. Halfway through the second load, she had gotten a splinter in the meat of her palm. A bad one. She had not told him. She had kept working. When they finished the load and drove back to the barn, she had climbed down from the wagon, and she had been trying to pull the splinter out with her fingernails, and she had been crying without making any sound. He had seen her. He had walked over. He had not said anything. He had taken her hand in his big square hand. He had turned it palm up. He had looked at the splinter for a moment. Then he had reached into the front pocket of his overalls, and he had come out with a small pocket knife with a wooden handle. He had opened the smallest blade, and he had very carefully, with the blade held sideways like a lever, worked the splinter out of her palm in 3 seconds. Then he had put his other hand, his free hand, on the back of her neck, and he had said, "You are not alone, Marin. Not ever. Do you hear me?" She had nodded. She had not been able to speak yet, but she had nodded. He had said, "Good." Then he had let her go, and he had gone back to the wagon. She sat on the workbench in the workshop, 14 years later, 24 years old, an orphan, for the second time, and she felt the shape of that hand on the back of her neck as if he had put it there 5 minutes before. She closed her eyes for a moment. She kept them closed until the feeling passed. Then she stood up. She hung the leather apron back on its peg. She turned off the workshop bulb. She walked back to the farmhouse across the frozen yard. June Calloway showed up on the fourth morning. She came across the north fence line in her mud-caked olive rubber boots. She wore a maroon corduroy jacket buttoned to the throat against the wind. Her steel gray hair was tucked behind her ears. She had a dented tin thermos with a red plastic cap clutched in her left hand like she had been born holding it. Her arms were crossed and her weight was shifted to one hip. She stood at the fence and she watched Marin haul water to the trough for a full 5 minutes before she said a single word. June Calloway had lived on the ridge north of Corwin Ashcroft's land for 41 years. She had buried a husband. She had run her own 22 head. She had known Corwin the way people know each other in a place like Harlan County, which is to say she had known him well enough to argue with him without ever raising her voice, and well enough to bring soup to the house when his wife passed in 1978, and well enough to attend his funeral in a black wool coat that had been out of fashion since 1960 and did not care. She had also thought for the last decade that Corwin's ideas about closed-loop farming were the kind of nonsense that would end with somebody's granddaughter standing in a field trying to figure out how to pay a county tax bill. She had been right about that last part. She was not gloating. She was just looking at the situation clear-eyed, which was the only way she knew how to look at anything. When she finally spoke, her voice was plain. "Your grandfather was a dreamer, Marin. Good man, sure, but a dreamer." Marin set the bucket down. She pushed a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear, away from those large blue-gray eyes that were the exact same color Corwin's had been. She did not answer. June unscrewed the thermos, poured herself coffee into the red plastic cap, took a slow drink. The steam came up around her face. "The smart move," June said, "the only move really is to sell the herd. Lease the pasture to the Dawson brothers. They've been circling this land for 6 years. They'll pay you decent. Take whatever the county will give you for the timber rights on the South 40. You're 24 years old. You don't have to die on this hill." That last sentence landed in the cold air between them like a stone dropped in a well. It was not said unkindly. That was what made it hurt. It was said the way an aunt might say it. It was said by a woman who had watched people die on hills before and who did not want to watch it happen again. Marin stood there with the bucket at her feet. Her fingers were red from the cold. Her cheeks were red from the wind. She looked at June Calloway across the fence line for a full 10 seconds before she spoke. "The farm is not for sale." 4 words, a closed door. June looked at her a long moment. Then she screwed the cap back on the thermos. She did not argue. She did not say another word about it. But her expression said plenty. Her expression said, "I have seen this before, honey, and I have seen how it ends." Her expression also said, "If you need me, I am across the north fence line, and I will not say I told you so." She turned and walked back the way she had come. Marin watched her go until she was a small figure crossing the winter grass. Then Marin picked the bucket back up and she carried it to the trough. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that they were shaking. She set the bucket down at the trough and she waited for the shaking to stop, and after a minute it did. That was on a Thursday. Dale Erickson drove up Route 38 the following Tuesday in a company truck with the Ridgeline Brewing logo on the door. Ridgeline Brewing was new. A craft operation 11 miles east, making pale ales and porters for the college kids in Lexington and the tourists passing through on their way to somewhere better. Dale was their operations manager. He was stocky, soft-bodied in the way men get when they have spent 15 years in an office chair. Sandy blonde hair combed neatly to the right and thinning on top. Pale blue eyes. A navy quarter-zip pullover over a crisp white Oxford. Pressed khaki chinos. Polished tan loafers that had no business being anywhere near a cattle farm. He clicked his silver ballpoint pen twice before he spoke. That click would become in the months to come the sound Marin associated with him more than any other. 2 clicks, then talk. 2 clicks, then talk. It was a habit he did not know he had. He had a problem, he said. Spent grain. Mountains of it. $75 a ton to haul it to the county landfill. And the brewery was producing more every week. He'd heard she had cattle. He thought maybe she could use it, free of charge. He said that part slowly. Free of charge. Like he was explaining a big word to somebody who had gotten lost on the way to somewhere simpler. 3 tons sat behind her barn, now already starting to sour in the cold air. Marin looked at him. She looked at the pile behind the barn. She looked back at Dale Erickson in his pressed chinos and his loafers. She did not answer right away. And Dale, who was used to filling silences, kept talking. "Look," he said, "I know what this looks like. Guy shows up, dumps a pile of wet slop on your property. But this is a courtesy. My guys were going to pay to dispose of it either way. I thought, hey, there's a young lady up on that Ashcroft place running some cattle. Maybe she can use it. Save us both a little something. What do you say?" He clicked the pen, twice. Marin pulled the leather-covered journal from the inside pocket of her canvas jacket. She did not open it in front of him. She held it against her sternum with both hands like a child holds a book at a school assembly. She looked at Dale Erickson. "I'll take it," she said. "All of it." Dale nodded, satisfied. He clicked the pen again. He produced a form on a clipboard and asked her to sign it. A 1-line release. She read it slowly. It said that she was accepting the material as is, and that Ridgeline Brewing would not be liable for anything that happened to it after delivery. She signed it. She kept the carbon. Dale said, "You'll want to spread that out to dry before it molds on you." Marin said, "I'll figure it out." He looked at her a moment longer. Something flickered in his face, and it was not concern. It was not condescension exactly either. It was closer to amusement. The look a man gives a kid who says she is going to be an astronaut. He clicked the pen one more time. He got in the truck. He drove away. The gravel popped under the tires and the smell of diesel hung in the cold air a full minute after the truck was gone. Marin stood in the yard with the carbon copy of the release in her hand and the leather journal in the other. And she looked at 3 tons of steaming, wet, spent grain sitting behind her barn, and she thought, all right, Grandpa, what now? She walked into the farmhouse. She set the journal on the kitchen table. She opened it. She turned the pages slowly with a hand that had gone cold from being outside. She was not looking for anything specific. She was looking the way her grandfather had taught her to look. Watch it, Marin. Don't fight it. Watch it. She had heard those words 100 times as a child. She heard them again now. She found the page on her third pass. It was near the middle of the journal. It was dated August of 1974. She would have been 7 years old then. Her grandfather would have been in the middle of a decade of experiments that the neighbors had shaken their heads at. The page was headed in his slanted, careful hand, Wet Forage Preservation. Under the heading, a diagram, a trench, a cross-section of what looked like the old concrete silo behind the dairy barn. Arrows showing airflow, arrows showing the direction of packing, arrows showing drainage. And below the diagram in his handwriting, the words that would change the next 30 years of her life. Lactic acid fermentation, same as sauerkraut, same as every jar of preserved vegetables in every farmhouse cellar from here to Bavaria. Pack the wet material tight enough that oxygen cannot reach it. Let the native bacteria do the work. They eat the sugars, they make lactic acid. The pH drops. Below 4, nothing bad can live in it. Below 4, you have feed that will hold 6 months. Below 4. Marin read the page 3 times. She sat at the kitchen table with the journal open under the single hanging bulb, and she read the page 3 times, and she felt the shape of the thing settle into her mind like a key finding a lock. Because most people hear spent grain and they think garbage, brewery waste, soggy cereal nobody wants. That is exactly what Dale Erickson and every other operations manager in a quarter-zip pullover wants you to think. Because the moment you understand what spent grain actually is, you realize they have been paying somebody $75 a load to throw away gold. Here is the science, and it matters. When a brewery mashes barley, they steep crushed malt in water heated to about 152 degrees Fahrenheit. That temperature activates enzymes amylase specifically that break the barley starches into simple sugars. The sugars dissolve into the water, which becomes wort, which becomes beer. What stays behind in the mash tun is the grain's structural skeleton, the hull, the fiber matrix. Here is the part that should make you angry. Nearly all of the protein survives. The mashing process barely touches it. Spent grain runs about 25% protein by dry weight. It is loaded with B vitamins, phosphorus, digestible fiber. It is pound for pound a better animal feed supplement than half the commercial products sitting on the shelf at the Harlan County Co-op at $4 a bag. It has been pre-processed by the brewery's own equipment. The starch is already stripped away, leaving behind a concentrated protein and fiber package that cattle can convert into weight and health with remarkable efficiency. If you can preserve it, that is the whole game. Because that heap behind Marin's barn is roughly 75 to 80% moisture. Wet, dense, warm from the residual heat of the mash. And at that moisture level in open air, that grain becomes a paradise for aspergillus mold. The gray-green fuzz you have seen on forgotten bread, except faster and meaner. Within 48 to 72 hours, the surface colonies establish. Within a week, mycotoxins saturate the mass. No animal with functioning instincts will eat it. And a cow that eats even a small amount of mycotoxin-contaminated feed can lose weight aboard a calf or die. The clock started the moment those tons hit the ground, and 3 days of Kentucky January weather was not going to slow it down enough. Marin tried the obvious thing first. She failed. On day 1, she dragged out every blue tarp she owned, 4 of them, frayed at the grommets, held together in places with duct tape. She shoveled wet grain across the tarps in layers about 2 inches thick, spreading it to dry. The idea was sound in theory. Reduce the moisture below 40% and mold cannot establish. simple thermodynamics. She had learned that in a 9-week vocational course at the community college in Lexington the year before, and it had made sense at the time. But this is Harlan County in January, and the sky does not care about your community college course. The temperature hovered at 34 degrees. A fine drizzle set in by noon, and it did not quit for 2 days. The grain on the tarps absorbed the rain instead of releasing moisture. It sat wet and cold and open to the air, and the wind carried spores across it that could not have found a better home if they had tried. By the morning of day 3, Marin walked out to the tarps and she saw it. That gray-green bloom spreading across the surface like a bruise. Soft, furred, with a smell halfway between wet cardboard and something sour and wrong. She touched it with 2 fingers, pulled them back, looked at the pale mold spores clinging to her skin. Her stomach dropped. She stood in the drizzle with the wind pulling the loose strands of hair around her face, and she looked at the tarps, and she did a calculation she did not want to do. Nearly a full ton gone. She forked a sample into the feed trough. Her 4 remaining Jersey cows came over slow curious, and the lead cow put her nose down to the trough and sniffed and pulled her head back sharp and snorted. She backed away. The other 3 did the same. They walked to the far corner of the pen, and they stood in a small cluster, and they did not look at the trough again. Animals know. They always know before you do. Marin stood there in the drizzle for a long minute. She did not cry. She had made a decision months back that she was not going to cry over cattle problems, and she was going to keep that decision if it killed her. Her hands were red and stiff. The wispy strands of chestnut hair around her face were plastered to her cheeks with rain. Her weathered tan canvas jacket was soaked black across the shoulders. She was 24 years old, and she was standing in a Kentucky field in January with a ton of moldy brewery slop in front of her and 80% of her plan gone before it had really started. She got the wheelbarrow. She got the pitchfork. She loaded the moldy grain into the wheelbarrow, load after miserable load. Her arms burned. Her boots were soaked through. She hauled the wheelbarrow across the yard to the far edge of the property, and she dumped it in a drainage ditch where it could break down over the spring, well away from the cattle and the water source, and anything that might make it worse than it already was. It took her 4 hours. She stopped once halfway through when the wheelbarrow tipped on a frozen rut and dumped a full load of moldy grain onto the frozen ground. She stood there looking at it. Her jaw was set. Her eyes were bright. She was breathing hard. And she thought, this is the part where a person quits. She thought it as clearly as if somebody in the field had said it out loud. This is the part. You lost a third of it. You are 24. You do not know what you are doing. You have $14,000 in back taxes and 38 cattle and a mold problem. And this is the part where a person quits. She stood there. She let the thought sit in the field like a person she was not going to answer. She heard her grandfather's voice then. Not loud, not commanding, just there. Watch it, Marin. Don't fight it. Watch it. She heard it the way you hear a radio playing in the next room. She was not sure whether it was memory or something more than memory. She did not much care about the difference in that moment. After a moment, she picked the shovel back up. She scooped the spilled load back into the wheelbarrow. She kept going. When she was done, she leaned the wheelbarrow against the barn, and she stood in the yard, and she looked at the 2 tons that were left. 2 tons behind the barn, maybe 60 hours before those went the same way as the ton in the ditch. She went inside. She peeled the wet jacket off. She hung it over the back of a kitchen chair. She stood at the sink and washed her hands with the yellow bar soap that had been in that dish for as long as she could remember. She did not turn the light on. The gray light through the window was enough. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and she opened the journal. She read the page on wet forage preservation again. She read it slowly. She underlined phrases in her own pencil the way her grandfather had underlined phrases. She turned the page. There were 3 more pages of notes she had not read yet. Pages on the specific mechanics of packing, on how tight was tight enough, on what to do if the material was too wet, on the pH strips he had ordered from a hardware supply catalog in 1976, in where he had kept them. She read those pages. She turned another page. And there on the fourth page, after the diagram in her grandfather's careful hand, was a sketch of the old concrete trench silo behind the dairy barn, the one she had been using to store fence posts. He had drawn it in cross-section. He had labeled the walls the drainage channel, the recommended fill height. He had drawn a small figure of a person standing on top of the pack, and next to the figure in his handwriting, he had written, "Walk it in, your weight is the tool." And below that, cover with black plastic. Weight the plastic with old tires. Seal the edges with dirt if you have to. Air is the enemy. Air is the whole enemy. Marin looked at the sketch for a long time. Her grandfather had built that trench silo in 1961. He had used it to ensile chopped corn in the 60s and 70s. He had let it fall out of use in the 80s when he could no longer afford the diesel to run the corn chopper. She had grown up walking past that silo. She had grown up using it as a storage bin. She had stacked fence posts in it 3 weeks ago when she had been thinking about spring repairs. She had never once seen it as what it was. He had seen it. He had drawn it. In 1974, when she was 7 years old, before he had any way of knowing what she would need it for, he had drawn her a picture of exactly the tool she was going to have to reach for on this exact night 17 years later. She put her hand flat on the page. She did not cry, she had promised. But she sat there at the kitchen table with her hand on the page for a long minute, and she felt the weight of him in the room, the way you feel the weight of somebody who has just walked in behind you but has not yet spoken. She said it out loud, to the empty kitchen, to the dark window, to the man who had drawn her a map before she was old enough to read it. She said, "I see it, Grandpa." 2 words. All right. She stood up. She pulled the wet canvas jacket back on over her shoulders. She buttoned it to the throat. She pulled the hood up. She took the journal off the table and she put it in the inside left pocket, right against the wool of the flannel right where he had told her to keep it. She picked up the lantern from the shelf by the door. She walked out into the dark at 11 at night in the January drizzle, and she went to the concrete trench silo behind the dairy barn, and she stood at the mouth of it, and she held the lantern up. The fence posts were stacked 6 deep. She was going to have to move all of them by morning. She was going to have to sweep the trench floor clean. She was going to have to check the drainage channel her grandfather had cut in 1961 to make sure it was still open, still draining, still doing the job he had built it to do. She set the lantern on top of the concrete wall of the silo. The light threw her shadow long across the yard behind her. She rolled up her sleeves inside the canvas jacket. Her forearms were lean and hard and already starting to ache from the 4 hours of shoveling that afternoon. She did not care. She reached for the first fence post. She worked in the dark and the drizzle until 3 in the morning. She moved every single fence post out of the trench silo. She stacked them under the eave of the equipment shed. She swept the concrete floor with a push broom until the surface was clean. She got down on her hands and knees, and she checked the drainage channel at the low end, and it was open and it was draining, and it was doing the job he had built it to do. When she was done, she stood at the mouth of the empty silo with the lantern in her hand. The rain had stopped. The wind was coming off the ridge in slow, cold waves. Her boots were caked with mud to the ankle. Her hands were raw. The wispy strands of hair around her face were dark with rain and stuck to her cheekbones. She was shaking a little from the cold, but not from anything else. She looked into the empty silo. She looked at the black concrete walls that her grandfather had poured with his own hands when John F. Kennedy was still alive. She looked at the drainage channel he had cut and the packing surface he had smoothed. And she thought about the 2 tons of steaming, spent grain sitting behind the barn on the other side of the yard, waiting for the sun to come up so it could start rotting in earnest. She thought, all right, Grandpa. She thought, I am going to walk 2 tons of brewery slop into a silo you built when I was in kindergarten. I am going to pack it with my own weight, one step at a time, the way you told me to. I am going to seal it under black plastic and weight it with old tires, and I am going to wait 21 days. And if it works, we save the herd. And if it does not work, we lose the farm. She picked up the lantern. She walked back across the yard toward the farmhouse. Her shadow moved with her against the barn wall. Behind her, the empty silo waited. And behind the barn, the 2 tons of spent grain sat under a tarp that would not hold them for another 24 hours. And the clock was already ticking, and the whole rest of her life was on the other side of a bacterial fermentation that a dead man had told her would work. She went inside. She hung the wet jacket over the chair. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the kitchen table under the single hanging bulb, and she opened the journal to a fresh page near the back, and she took a pencil out of the tin cup on the counter, and she wrote the date. December 4th, 1991. Below the date in her own handwriting, which was already starting to slant a little to the right, the way his had, she wrote, "Lost 1 ton to mold, 2 tons left, silo ready, packing tomorrow at first light, 21 days. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line below it and underlined it once. Waste is just a resource without a destination. She closed the journal. She put it in the pocket of the jacket that was drying on the chair. She poured the kettle. She sat at the kitchen table in the dark with a cup of coffee in her hands, and she did not sleep for the rest of the night. She sat there and she watched the window over the sink go from black to gray. She watched the shape of the barn appear against the sky. She watched the ridgeline come up out of the dark like a photograph developing in a tray. At 6 in the morning, she stood up. She poured the last of the coffee into the sink. She pulled on the jacket still damp at the shoulders. She buttoned it to the throat. She pulled the hood up. She walked out into the yard. The 2 tons of spent grain sat behind the barn. Steam was rising off the pile in the cold. It smelled faintly sweet and faintly sour, and if you knew what to smell for, you could already catch the first hint of what would kill it if she did not move fast. Marin stood in front of the pile with a pitchfork in one hand and a wheelbarrow at her feet. The lantern was still hanging from her other hand, though the sun was starting to come up now, and she did not need it. She looked at the pile. She looked at the barn. She looked past the barn to the concrete silo behind the dairy shed. She set the lantern down. She put both hands on the pitchfork. She said out loud to nobody, "All right." Then she got to work. She worked from 6 in the morning until noon without stopping. Wheelbarrow after wheelbarrow, load after load. She pushed the wheelbarrow across the yard from the pile behind the barn to the mouth of the concrete trench silo behind the dairy shed. The distance was 42 paces. She counted them the first time. She counted them the second time. After the 10th trip, she stopped counting. The spent grain was heavy, wetter than it looked. A wheelbarrow load ran maybe 200 pounds, and she was moving 2 full tons in loads that weighed a third of what she did. Her forearms burned. Her lower back burned. The wispy strands of chestnut hair around her face stuck to her cheekbones with sweat even in the cold. She stripped the canvas jacket off after the 4th trip and tied it around her waist by the sleeves. She worked in the red and cream plaid flannel, and it went dark at the shoulder blades within the hour. She dumped each load at the mouth of the silo. She spread it inside with the pitchfork, 6 inches at a time, even layers, the way the sketch had shown her. When the layer was down, she climbed into the silo in her scuffed brown work boots, and she walked it, corner to corner, slowly, pressing her weight into every step, driving the air out. The grain compressed under her boots with a sound like wet clay being kneaded. She could feel it going dense beneath her, and she could feel the moisture rising up around the sides of her boots, and she could feel in a way she could not have put into words at the time that she was doing something her grandfather had walked through in his head 50 years before her. Between layers, she scattered handfuls of dry hay from a broken bale in the loft. Not much, maybe 5% of the volume, the way the note said. The hay would absorb excess surface moisture. It would provide a carbon lattice for the lactic acid bacteria to colonize. She did not fully understand the second part yet. She understood the first part. She scattered the hay and she went back for the next load. By noon, she had 1 ton in. By 4 in the afternoon, she had the second ton in. She was moving slower by then. Her hands had gone numb around the handles of the wheelbarrow. She had blistered through the palms of both leather gloves. She could feel the blisters weeping inside the leather, but she did not stop to look at them. She knew if she looked at them, she would have to sit down, and if she sat down, she was not sure she would get up. At 4:30 in the last hard blue light of the January afternoon, she leveled the top of the pack with the flat of a rake. She smoothed it corner to corner. Then she climbed out of the silo. She stood at the top of the concrete wall, and she looked down at what she had built. 2 tons of spent grain, packed flat, the color of pale straw with darker streaks where the moisture had risen. The surface flat enough to walk on without stumbling. She reached for the roll of black plastic sheeting she had bought that morning at the co-op in town. It had cost her $9.40. She had paid in cash out of a coffee can that had $37 left in it. She unrolled the plastic across the top of the pack. She pulled it tight to the edges. She weighted the corners with the first tires, then the sides, then the middle. Old tractor tires, 6 of them, stacked in twos where the wind could catch the plastic worst. Air was the enemy. Air was the whole enemy. She kicked dirt along the edges of the plastic where it met the concrete wall. She kicked more dirt. She got down on her hands and knees in the last of the light, and she pressed the plastic down along the seams with her bare hands, and she did not stop until the seal was as tight as she could make it. Then she stood up. Her back would not straighten all the way. She let it stay bent for a moment, hands on her thighs, breathing. She watched her breath come out white in the cold. She looked at the black plastic weighted with tires, and she looked at the concrete walls her grandfather had poured, and she thought, all right, Grandpa, it is your silo now. Do your work. She did not go inside for another 20 minutes. She stood at the edge of the silo. She put one gloved hand flat on top of the plastic. She could feel the density of the pack under it. Solid, airless, sealed. 21 days. She turned and walked back to the farmhouse in the dark. That was on the 4th of December, 1991. The next 21 days were the longest of her life. Every morning at first light, she walked out to the silo. She stood at the edge. She did not lift the plastic. That would have let air in and undone everything. She just stood there and she looked at it. She put her hand on top of the plastic. She felt the density. She listened. She was not sure what she was listening for. Some nights she thought she could hear the pack settling, a small sound like a house settling on its foundation. She could not tell if she was imagining it. She did the other work too. She fed the 38 head with the last of the hay bales in the loft. She hauled water twice a day. She patched a section of fence along the west line that a deer had gone through in November. She repaired the leaking spot in the roof over the back bedroom, standing on a ladder in the drizzle, with a can of roofing tar and a putty knife. And she did it because if she did not do it, no one else was going to. The tax notice sat under the sugar bowl on the kitchen table. She looked at it every morning when she poured her coffee. She did not touch it. She was not ready to touch it yet. On the 7th day, Dr. Harmon came out. She had not called him. He had heard from somebody at the co-op that Corwin Ashcroft's granddaughter was running the place alone now, and he had decided on his own to drive over and check on the herd. Dr. Harmon had been the county large animal vet for 19 years. He was in his late 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a gray mustache that hung over his upper lip in a way that made his mouth invisible until he spoke. He wore Carhartt coveralls in the winter and a slouched brown felt hat that had seen more weather than most barns. I walked the cattle for an hour. He put his stethoscope to the ribs of 6 different head. He ran his hand along the flanks. He lifted a lip and checked the color of the gums on the lad cow. When he was done, he came back to where Marin was standing by the gate. He said, "They're thin, Marin. They're not sick, but they're thin." Marin nodded. She knew. He said, "You got a plan for the winter feed." Marin looked at him for a moment. Then she looked past him at the silo behind the dairy shed, at the black plastic, weighted with tires that anybody looking at from the road would have taken for a compost heap. She said, "I've got a plan." Dr. Harmon looked at her. He did not push. 19 years in this county had taught him when not to push. He nodded once. He scratched his mustache with one gloved finger. He said, well, you call me if anything goes sideways. Corwin was a good man. He'd want somebody looking out for you. Marin said thank you. He got in his truck. He drove away. She stood at the gate for a long minute after his taillights disappeared down the road. She thought about the way he had said the word thin. Not sick, thin. There was a difference. Thin was fixable. Thin was a math problem. She had a math problem. She had a math problem sitting in a concrete silo behind the dairy shed under black plastic and old tires, and if the math worked thin, would fix itself. On the 10th day, Dale Erickson called. I wanted to schedule the next delivery. He had another 2.5 tons ready to go. He said, pleased with the arrangement so far. He said it the way you say pleased about a piece of business you are secretly gloating over. Marin could hear the click of the silver pen in the background of the call. 2 clicks, then talk. She told him not yet, not this week. She said she was still processing the first load. She would call him when she was ready. There was a pause on the line. Dale said, processing, you mean spreading. Marin said, I'll call you. She hung up. She stood at the wall phone in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the receiver. She did not want Dale Erickson driving up her gravel road while there was a black plastic-covered mound behind the dairy shed. He was not stupid. He would ask, and she was not ready to answer. On the 14th day, June Calloway drove past on the road below the north fence line. Slowly. Marin saw the truck from the yard. She recognized the dented right rear quarter panel. June was leaning forward over the steering wheel, looking up toward the farmhouse. She did not stop. She did not honk. She just drove past slow, and she looked and she drove on. Marin stood in the yard and watched the truck disappear down the road. She thought June is watching. June is going to keep watching. And what June sees over the next few weeks is going to be either the thing that changes her mind or the thing that proves her right. She went back to work. On the 18th day, she almost did it. She almost went out and lifted the plastic to check. It was late at night. It was raining. She had been lying in her grandmother's iron bed in the front room, and she had not been able to sleep. And after 2 hours of turning the mattress over inside her own head, she had gotten up and she had gotten dressed and she had walked out into the yard in the rain with a lantern in her hand. She had stood at the edge of the silo for a full 10 minutes. Her hand had been on the corner of the plastic. She had been thinking that if she just lifted the corner a little, just enough to see, just enough to know she could put it back down before enough air got into matter. It would be a peek, nothing more than a peek. She had heard Corwin's voice again. Watch it, Marin. Don't fight it. Watch it. Watching in this case meant not lifting the plastic. Watching meant waiting. Watching meant trusting a process that a man had described to her from beyond the grave, and trusting it without opening it and trusting it for 3 more days. She had let her hand fall to her side. She had picked the lantern back up. She had walked back to the house. She had gone to bed. She had lain there listening to the rain, and after a while she had slept. On the 21st day, the 25th of December, Christmas morning, Marin woke up at 4 in the morning without an alarm. She had not slept much. She had lain in her grandmother's iron bed in the front room, and she had watched the moon move across the window frame. She had gotten up twice to look out at the yard, to look at the shape of the silo in the moonlight, to make sure it was still there. It was still there. At 4, she gave up. She got dressed. She pulled on the red and cream plaid flannel and the faded medium blue jeans and the weathered tan canvas jacket. She pulled her hair back into the low ponytail with the same leather cord she had been using for 4 years. She pushed her feet into the scuffed brown work boots. She took the lantern down from the peg by the door. She went outside. The frost was on the gravel. Her breath came out in slow white plumes. There was no wind. The stars over the ridge were sharp and thick, the way stars are in Kentucky in winter when the air is dry. She walked across the yard to the silo. She held the lantern up. The black plastic was intact. The tires were where she had left them. She could see in the lantern light the frost that had settled overnight on the top of the plastic. It caught the yellow light and gave the whole surface a faint sparkle. She set the lantern on top of the concrete wall. She took a breath. She reached down and she pulled the first tire off, then the second, Then the third. Her hands were cold. The tires were heavy with the settled dew that had frozen onto their rims. She moved them off to one side. She kept going. 6 tires. Then she peeled the black plastic back slow from one corner. The smell hit her first. Sharp, sweet, clean. It was not the smell of manure. It was not the smell of mold. It was the smell of sourdough bread, the smell of sauerkraut fermenting in a crock, the smell of every good acid ferment she had ever put her nose to. She stopped breathing for a second. Then she peeled the plastic further. She got the whole corner uncovered. She leaned forward. She reached down into the silo with both hands, and she pulled up a fistful of what was inside. She held her hand up in the lantern light. The material was golden brown, not gray, not green, not black. Golden brown, the color of good tobacco leaf, shot through with the pale ghosts of barley husks. It was textured, fibrous, dense. It held its shape when she squeezed it, and when she released the squeeze, it fell apart between her fingers into loose crumbles that dropped back into the silo with a soft sound. She squeezed again. Moisture beaded between her fingers but did not stream. That was critical. Too wet and you get the wrong fermentation. Butyric acid. Silage that smells like vomit and cattle will not touch. Too dry and the lactic acid bacteria never get going, never drop the pH low enough to preserve anything. This was neither. This was right. This was exactly what her grandfather's note said it should be. This was in the words he had written in that journal material that should fall apart, like a friend letting go of a handshake. She stood there in the cold with a fistful of fermented spent grain in her palm, and she felt the whole world go very quiet. She reached into the chest pocket of her canvas jacket. She pulled out the pH strip. She had bought a small pack of them at the pharmacy in Harlan a week before along with the black plastic. She had chosen the ones that read down to a pH of 3. She had read the instructions 3 times. She pressed one strip into the liquid pooling in her cupped palm. She waited. She held the strip up against the color chart printed on the back of the strip packet. The strip turned a color that was somewhere between the reading for 4.0 and the reading for 3.5. She looked at it. She looked at it again. She held it up to the lantern to be sure. 3.8. 3.8 was below 4. 3.8 was under the line. 3.8 was in her grandfather's underlined handwriting from 1974. The number that meant the lactobacillus had won and the mold had lost, and this grain was preserved, stable, safe to feed. Marin stood at the edge of the silo with a pH strip in one hand and a fistful of golden brown silage in the other, and her breath was coming fast, and her eyes were wet in a way she had not allowed them to be in 3 weeks. She did not let the tears fall. She had promised. But she stood there in the lantern light for a full minute, and she looked up at the ridgeline where the first gray of dawn was starting to come up over the trees, and she said out loud to the air, to her grandfather, to the whole cold Kentucky morning that did not know what she had just done, she said, "You were right." 3 words. That was all. Then she put the pH strip in the chest pocket of her jacket right next to the journal, and she pulled the black plastic back over the pack. She weighted it with the tires again. She would open it properly at first light when she could see and when the cattle could see too. She walked back to the farmhouse. She was not shaking anymore. The sun was coming up. She fed them at 7 o'clock that morning. She mixed the spent grain silage 50-50 with the remaining hay in the wheelbarrow. She forked it into the long wooden feed trough along the east fence. She stepped back. The 38 Angus crosses drifted over from the north end of the pasture. Steam rose off their backs in the cold. They came slow at first, the way cattle always come to a new feed curious but not committed. The lead cow, a broad-faced matriarch with a small crooked blaze on her forehead. Marin had privately started calling her. Number 7 dropped her nose into the trough. She sniffed. She pulled back. She sniffed again. She took a mouthful. She chewed, slowly. Her jaw moved in that slow lateral grind that is either contentment or thinking, and it is very hard to tell which. She paused. She looked up at Marin for a long second across the top of the trough. Then she took another mouthful. Marin did not breathe. By the time number 7 had taken her third mouthful, 3 of the other cows had come to the trough. By the time she had taken her fifth, 7 cows were feeding. By the time Marin had finished her cup of coffee, standing in the yard in the cold, the whole herd was crowded around the trough. Shoulders working, heads down, that low collective sound of a herd that has found something good. Marin set the coffee cup down on the fence post. She said out loud to the herd, to the cold, to the empty yard behind her, "All right." The cattle did not look up. They kept eating. Over the next 3 days, the pattern held. By the second day, the hesitation was gone. By the third day, the cattle were crowding the trough when they heard the wheelbarrow come across the gravel. They were shouldering each other aside for position. And on the fourth morning, she did the test she had been meaning to do all week. She filled the east trough with the silage mix. Then she filled the west trough with straight hay from the loft. Third cutting, stemmy, the last of the winter hay. She led the herd to the middle of the pen and she stepped back. She wanted to see which trough they went to first. She wanted to see who they trusted. They walked past the hay. Not one of them stopped at it. Not one of them dropped a nose to it. They walked past the hay to get to the silage. The whole herd, 38 animals with functioning instincts and thousands of years of evolutionary experience about which feed to trust. They walked past the hay. Protein content of spent brewer's grain runs around 25% on a dry matter basis, nearly triple what her stemmy third-cutting hay could offer. The cattle knew it before the numbers confirmed it. And the numbers. Lord, the numbers. Commercial grain supplement had been bleeding her at $186 per ton. That was what the feed store in Cumberland charged, and they did not negotiate. Not for a 24-year-old woman running a place half the county already considered a foreclosure in progress. The spent grain silage cost her exactly $0 for the raw material. Dale Erickson was giving it away. He was, if you counted the disposal fee, he was saving grateful to give it away. Her only expenses were the black plastic sheeting, the pH strips, and the labor to pack and seal each load. $12 per ton all in. She did the math on a receipt envelope from the pharmacy with a pencil stub sitting at the kitchen table under the single hanging bulb. $12 against $186. She underlined the difference so hard the pencil tore the paper. Then she wrote the daily feed cost per head. She had been running $4.89 per head per day at commercial supplement rates. That was what she had budgeted or would have budgeted if she had been able to afford it. That was what the extension bulletin recommended for a herd of Angus crosses running on stemmed hay and needing to gain weight before spring. Multiply by 120 winter days. $22,266. Money she simply did not have. Money that had been the wall between her and keeping the farm. She recalculated at the new rate. Spent grain silage plus the remaining hay at actual cost. 61 cents per head per day. For the full winter, $782. She stared at the figure. She wrote it again below the first one. $782 instead of $22,000. The $14,000 in back taxes. The number that had felt like a death sentence in September. That number now had air around it. Breathable air. Not solved. Not yet. But survivable. For the first time since Corwin had died, the arithmetic on the kitchen table did not end with her losing the farm. She closed the envelope. She pressed her palm flat against the leather cover of the journal on the table beside her. She sat in the quiet for a long time. Then she stood up. She put on her jacket. She walked out to the silo. She stood at the edge of the pack in the moonlight. She said out loud, "All right, Grandpa, we're in business." Then she went back to the house and slept for the first solid 6 hours she had slept in 6 weeks. The rhythm found itself inside a week. Ridgeline Brewing produced roughly 1.5 tons of spent grain every 7 days. The byproduct of their pale ales, their porters, their seasonal wheat beer that tourists bought by the pint without ever wondering where the mash went afterward. Dale Erickson started scheduling regular Tuesday deliveries. His guys would back the flatbed up to Marin's trench silo, dump the steaming wet grain in a heap, and leave. Marin would spend the afternoon spreading it in 6-inch layers, packing each one with the rear tires of Corwin's old Ford tractor, rolling back and forth until the grain was dense and airless. Fresh grain in one end, cured silage pulled from the other. A living conveyor belt of fermentation, always moving, always feeding. June Calloway drove past on a Wednesday, slowed her truck to a crawl along the fence line. Through the window, her brown eyes tracked the herd. The Angus crosses were standing broad and calm at the trough. Their coats were already thickening with winter undercoat. Their ribs did not show the way they had in October. June's dented tin thermos sat on the dashboard. Her arms stayed crossed even while she steered. She said nothing. She did not stop. She did not wave. She drove past. That silence told Marin more than a compliment ever could. Spring of 1992 came slow to Harlan County the way it always does. Frost pulling back from the hollows one ridge at a time. Mud season dragging its boots across every dirt road. And when the cattle stepped out of the barn into that weak March light, people noticed. They noticed because Marin Ashcroft's herd looked wrong. Wrong for a woman who had not bought a single bag of commercial feed since December. Wrong for a 38-head operation running on whatever slop the brewery dumped on her land. The coats were glossy, not just healthy, glossy. The way a horse looks after somebody has been currying it for an hour. The ribs did not show. The eyes were clear and calm and unbothered. When the herd walked, they walked with the loose, easy gait of cattle that had not been hungry in a long time. Dr. Harmon came out for the spring weigh-in on a Tuesday morning in late March. He stood at the chute in the same Carhartt coveralls he had worn at Christmas, and his slouched brown felt hat sat low on his brow, and he did not say much. He had not said much the last time he was there either. But this time something was different. His mouth kept doing this thing. This half-open, half-closed thing like he was about to say something and then deciding to just write it down instead. Average weight across the herd was 1,180 pounds. County average that spring was 1,035. That was 14% above, 14%. On homemade silage and hay from her own fields, supplemented by nothing but spent grain and stubbornness and a dead man's handwriting in a leather-covered book. Dr. Harmon checked the rumen health on 3 head. He listened for a long time with his stethoscope. He palpated. He looked at the color of the gums. He looked at the state of the coats. Then he stepped back from the chute, and he looked at Marin across it, and he pushed his hat up on his forehead with the back of his wrist, and he said in the flat voice of a man who has been surprised and is not sure how to say so, "That fiber content in your spent grain, that's functioning as a superior roughage source, Marin, better than straight hay. The barley hulls and the residual malt sugars are feeding the gut bacteria a more complex diet. They're not just eating, they're digesting more efficiently, more nutrient extraction per pound of feed." He looked at her another moment. He said, "Whatever you're doing per pound of feed." He looked at her another moment. He said, "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." Marin nodded. She said, "Yes, sir." That was the whole conversation. Dr. Harmon got in his truck. He sat behind the wheel for a moment before he started it. Marin could see him from the barn door. He was looking at something on his clipboard. He was writing on it. Then he capped his pen. He looked up. He looked past the pasture, past the barn, to the concrete silo behind the dairy shed with its cover of black plastic and old tires. He looked at it for maybe 5 seconds. He did not ask about it. Then he started the truck and he drove away. Marin stood at the barn door until his taillights disappeared. Then she pulled the journal out of her jacket pocket and she opened it to the current page, and she wrote, "Herd AVG 180 lbs, County AVG 1035, plus 14%. Harmon confirmed, said keep doing it." She underlined the last 3 words. She put the journal back in her pocket. She went back to work. Here is where the whole thing starts to spiral. Not out of control, into control. Tighter and tighter like a spring winding down to its center. The cattle produced manure, obviously, but Marin did not just spread it raw. She took the manure and she mixed it with a small fraction of spent grain that spoiled before she could get it into the silo. Maybe 5% of each delivery. The stuff that arrived too wet or sat too long on the truck bed or ended up on the outside edge of the pile where it was exposed to air overnight. She forked all of it into windrows behind the barn. Then she layered it with the straw bedding from the stalls. Corwin's journal, page 47, in that slanted, careful cursive. Fast compost wants 25:1 carbon to nitrogen. Straw is your carbon. Manure and grain are your nitrogen. Get close to 25 and it will cook in 6 weeks. The spent grain ran high in nitrogen. The straw bedding ran high in carbon. Mixed with cattle manure, the ratio landed almost exactly at 25:1. She did not need a lab test to confirm it. She shoved her hand into the center of a windrow after 3 weeks and it was hot. 140 degrees. Hot enough that she pulled her fingers back fast. The pile was cooking. Weed seeds were dying. Pathogens were burning off. What came out the other side 6 weeks later was dark, crumbly, and it smelled like a forest floor after rain. That compost went on to the hayfields in April. One growing season. That was all it took. She pulled soil samples from her test plot in September and sent them to the state lab. Organic matter came back at 1.6%. It had been 1.1 when she started. Half a percentage point does not sound like much until you understand what it means. That soil was holding more water, feeding more microbial life, releasing more nutrients to the grass roots. The hay yield climbed from 1.9 bales per acre to 2.4. She was growing better hay to supplement the silage she was already making from the spent grain that was already feeding the cattle that were already producing the manure that was already becoming the compost. The loop closed, the snake ate its tail, and every rotation made the system stronger. Dale Erickson called on a Thursday in September of 1992. He had a proposal. Marin could hear the click of the silver pen on the other end of the line. 2 clicks. Then talk. She could picture him leaning back in his office chair, hands clasped over that soft paunch pen tucked behind his right ear. The way a man sits when he thinks he is about to do somebody a favor and expects to be thanked for it. He offered her a formal arrangement. 2 tons per week, guaranteed delivery. And here was the kicker. He would pay her $15 per ton as a disposal credit. He let that sit for a second on the line. He was waiting for her to react. She did not. He kept going. He said, "I'm going out on a limb here, Marin. Corporate doesn't usually do disposal credits for hobby operations." He actually said that. Hobby operations. She was standing at the wall phone in the kitchen, the receiver against her ear. She could see through the window over the sink 38 Angus crosses grazing in the south pasture. Their coats caught the late afternoon light. They looked from that distance like a Norman Rockwell painting of what cattle are supposed to look like. She could see past the herd the 2 concrete silos behind the dairy shed, one active and one being packed. She could see the compost windrows steaming in the cool September air. She could see the hayfields going bronze at the edges where the second cutting was almost ready. Hobby operation. She thought about the $14,000 in back taxes that she had paid off in full in July, 6 months ahead of the county's revised deadline. She thought about the $782 in feed costs she was projecting for the coming winter. She thought about the 14% above county average weight gain. She thought about the standing offer from a slaughterhouse buyer in Lexington who had tasted her marbling on a friend's plate and wanted to know if she could commit to 16 head next fall at a premium. She thought about how her grandfather had died in November of last year without seeing any of this. She thought about how he had never asked her to prove him right. He had only asked her to look. She thought about the tone in Dale Erickson's voice, the polished loafer tone, the going out on a limb tone, the condescension so smooth that a person who was not paying attention would miss it. She had been paying attention. She said, "I'll need a receipt." 3 words, a closed door. There was a small pause on the line. Then Dale said, "A receipt." She said for the disposal credit, $15 per ton, in writing, with the tonnage recorded and the date stamped. Same as I would get from any other buyer. She said it flat. She said it the way her grandfather had taught her to say things when she was 10 years old, and a stranger was trying to hand her a piece of candy that she had not asked for. Dale said, well, sure, of course. I can have the paperwork drawn up. She said, I'll expect the first receipt on the first Tuesday of October. He said, okay. She hung up. She stood at the wall phone for a moment with her hand on the receiver. She could hear very faintly the hum of the herd out in the pasture. She could hear the tick of the kitchen clock. She could hear her own breath. She noticed that her hand on the receiver was steady. She had not been sure it would be. She pulled the journal out of her pocket and she sat at the kitchen table and she wrote in her own careful, slanted hand, which was starting to look more like Corwin's. Every month, Dale wants to pay me $15 ton to take his waste. He called us a hobby operation, told him I'd need a receipt. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line below it and she underlined it once. He'll pay it. He has no choice. She closed the journal. She sat at the kitchen table in the late afternoon light. The sun was going off the ridge. Her cattle were in the south pasture. Her silos were full. Her hay fields were bronze at the edges. And a man in a quarter-zip pullover in an office 11 miles east had just agreed without knowing he had agreed to it that she was not a hobby. She was a business. The county extension agent showed up in late May, 10 months later. Doug Pruitt, clipboard, polished shoes on a gravel drive. You can already see where this is going. He had heard about the silage operation. He said, concerned. He talked about mycotoxin testing. He talked about FDA feed regulations. He talked about liability. He talked about what happens when a cow drops dead and the lab traces it back to unregulated brewery waste, and the state agriculture department decides to make an example of somebody. He was not entirely wrong about the risk. He was entirely wrong about Marin. She listened to him for the full 5 minutes it took him to work through his prepared paragraph. She stood at the fence line in the same red and cream plaid flannel and weathered tan canvas jacket, her hair pulled back in the same low ponytail, the leather-covered journal visible in the inside pocket of the jacket. She let him finish. Then she said, come with me. She walked him to the kitchen. She sat him down at the table where Corwin's tax notice had sat under the sugar bowl only 10 months before, though the notice was long gone, now paid in full. She went to the photocopier at the back of the pantry, an old Xerox machine her grandfather had bought at an auction in 1982, and kept working through the sheer force of his will. She opened the journal. She turned to 3 specific pages. She photocopied them one by one. She brought them back to the table. She handed them to Doug Pruitt. He looked down at them. Page 1, fermentation protocol, moisture targets, timing, written in Corwin's slanted, careful hand. Page 2, pH testing schedule, the exact benchmarks, the strip supplier and part number, written in Corwin's hand with Marin's corrections in the margin. Page 3, temperature log format, a blank template, filled out samples from Marin's actual batches dated, initialed, signed. Doug Pruitt read them. He read them once. He read them again. His clipboard sat forgotten on the table beside him. Marin said every batch tested, every reading recorded, every number clean. She said, those are my terms. Doug Pruitt looked up at her. He said, may I have copies of these for the office? Marin said, that's fine. The county extension agent filed a report the following month. The report noted that the Ashcroft herd's weight gain was 14% above the county average. The report did not name Marin. The report did not name Corwin. The report used the phrase area producers, and it recommended that other small farms in Harlan County consider studying the practice. Doug Pruitt drove home from Marin's kitchen that afternoon in his county Ford, and somewhere between Ashcroft's gate and the highway, he pulled over to the side of the road and he sat with the 3 photocopy pages in his lap, and he read them a third time. I was 56 years old. He had been the county extension agent for 22 years. He had a college degree in animal science from the University of Kentucky. He had spent his whole career explaining to farmers why they could not do things the old way anymore. He sat in his truck on the side of the road with 3 pages of a dead man's handwriting in his lap, and he thought about how he had walked into that farmhouse to warn a 24-year-old woman about liability and had walked out with what looked, if he was being honest, like the best designed small-scale feed operation he had seen in his career. He put the pages in his glove compartment. He drove home. He did not tell anybody at the office what he was thinking. He did not know yet what he was thinking. Fall came to Harlan County. The hay fields were harvested. The compost windrows were turned. The silos were topped off. The herd was moved to the winter pasture. And in a farmhouse on 240 acres of eastern Kentucky, a 24-year-old, now 25-year-old woman in a red and cream plaid flannel, in a weathered tan canvas jacket, sat at the kitchen table with a leather-covered journal open in front of her. And she wrote in a hand that was starting to slant hard to the right, the way her grandfather's had. End of year 1. Herd gained. Taxes paid. Silo full. Started the compost loop. Bulletin filed. Doug asked for copies. She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote one more line. Under it, in small, careful letters. He was right about all of it. She closed the journal. She put it in the pocket of the jacket that was hanging on the back of the chair. She went outside to feed the cattle. The trouble came on a Thursday in October of 1993. Dale Erickson pulled up in a company truck that had been freshly washed, which was already a bad sign. A man who washes his truck before delivering wet grain has something else on his mind. He stepped out. He clicked that silver pen twice. He tucked it behind his right ear. He leaned against the tailgate like he had all the time in the world. That soft double chin caught the light. Those pale blue eyes did not blink enough. He said, "Figured you should hear it from me." Polite as a funeral director. He said, "Ridgeline Brewing has been acquired." He said it slowly. He let it sit. He was watching her face for a reaction. She did not give him one. A regional outfit called Clearwater Brands. The kind of company that puts words like synergy and streamline on PowerPoint slides nobody asked for. Clearwater had bought the whole operation 2 weeks earlier. New logo, new management structure, new policies on, and here Dale used air quotes, waste stream accountability. What that meant in plain English was that Clearwater wanted to contract with a licensed commercial composting facility for spent grain disposal. A real company, with insurance, with a truck that had a logo on the side. Not a 24-year-old, now 25-year-old woman with a dead man's journal and a herd of cattle that ate better than most people in the county. Dale delivered this news the way he delivered everything. Leaning back, hands clasped over the paunch, projecting that relaxed authority, like he was doing her a favor by even showing up. Nothing personal, he said. Corporate's corporate. Brit. Nothing personal, sure. He said one more thing before he left. He said the delivery scheduled for the following Tuesday would probably be the last one. Clearwater was already lining up the new contract. He was sorry it had shaken out this way. He clicked the pen behind his ear, then tucked it into his shirt pocket, and he got in the truck. The gravel popped under the tires as he backed out. Marin stood in the yard for a long minute after he was gone. She did not go inside. She walked around the barn to where the 2 silos stood behind the dairy shed. She stood at the mouth of the second silo, the one she had built with her own 2 hands the summer before. 40 feet long, poured concrete walls reinforced with number 4 rebar on 16-inch centers. She had mixed and poured that silo on 3 weekends in June and July, renting a small mixer from the equipment yard in town, working alone from 6 in the morning until the light gave out. Total cost $2,200 paid cash from profits she had banked across 2 years of above-average cattle sales. She put her hand on the concrete wall of the silo she had built. She stood there with her palm flat against the cold concrete for maybe 30 seconds. Then she said out loud to the empty yard, "All right." She went inside. 2 weeks later, the Clearwater Brands logistics manager arrived. If Dale Erickson was the face of polite institutional indifference, this man was the entire body. His name was Redford Halstead. He was maybe 35. He wore polished tan shoes on a gravel driveway. He carried a clipboard with a form already half filled out. He spoke in complete paragraphs. He used the phrase liability exposure 3 times in 4 minutes. I explained that organic waste disposal required a licensed facility under Kentucky environmental regulations. He explained that Clearwater Brands could not in good conscience continue an informal arrangement. He explained that he understood this might be an inconvenience. An inconvenience. 2 years of work, 2 years of silage, 2 years of soil amendment, 2 years of watching her herd's body condition scores climb from 5s to solid 7s. 2 years of the loop closing tighter and tighter until it fed itself. An inconvenience. He extended a business card between 2 fingers. Marin looked at the card. She looked at him. Her light blue-gray eyes did not waver. Her hands stayed at her sides, those ropey forearms still deliberate, not a flinch in them. She did not take the card. She said, "The farm is not for sale," which was not what he had asked, but it answered everything he meant. Redford Halstead stood there for a moment. He was not sure what to do with what she had just said. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the card in his hand. He looked at Marin. He set the card on the porch railing. He nodded once the way a man nods when he has decided that further conversation is not going to be useful, and he walked back to his car. He drove away. The wind took the business card off the porch railing before the taillights had disappeared. The card went end over end across the gravel drive and lodged against the base of the mailbox post, and it stayed there for 2 days before a heavier wind took it into the field beyond the road, and Marin never saw it again. That night the rain came in. It hit the tin roof of the farmhouse like gravel. She sat at the kitchen table with the single hanging bulb burning above her. The leather-covered journal was open beside a yellow legal pad. She had the numbers laid out. Feed costs without the spent grain. Back to $186 per ton for commercial supplement. The back taxes were paid. The herd was healthy. But the margins, those slim, stubborn margins she had built penny by penny, they vanished. They just evaporated, like they had never been real. She stared at the journal. The leather was cracked along the spine now, dark with palm oil from Corwin's hands. Dark with palm oil from her hands, which had held it every day for 2 years. She thought about selling the herd. She thought about what the livestock auction would bring. She thought about the easy math of liquidation. Here is the thing about doubt. Real doubt. The kind that sits on your chest at 2 in the morning. It does not roar. It whispers. It says reasonable things. It says you tried. It says nobody would blame you. It says you did more than anybody thought you could. You do not have to prove any more than you have already proved. Marin sat with that voice for a long time. She let it talk. She did not argue with it. She had learned from Corwin that arguing with a bad idea gave it more life than it deserved. She just sat there and she listened to it. The rain kept coming. After a while, she pushed back from the table. She pulled on that weathered tan canvas jacket. The journal was in the inside left pocket, right against the wool of the flannel. She buttoned the jacket to the throat. She pulled the hood up. She walked out into the rain. The barn was warm. That was the first thing. Warm enough that she could feel it in her hands as she pulled the door shut behind her. The smell hit her second. Clean straw. Fermented grain. The deep animal musk of healthy cattle bedded down for the night. They were calm, standing or lying in their stalls, chewing cud with that slow lateral grind that means contentment. Their coats were thick, glossy under the single hanging bulb. She ran her hand along the flank of the nearest cow, and she felt the density of it. No ribs showing, no rough patches, no dullness. She walked the length of the barn slowly. She stopped at every third stall. She put her hand on every cow she stopped at. She was not counting them. She had counted them 1,000 times. She was reminding herself of them. She was letting her hand tell her the story that the yellow legal pad could not. She walked out of the barn and around to the back to the silos. Full, both of them, properly packed, properly sealed. The black plastic weighted with tires the way the journal prescribed. Months of feed secured. Enough silage in those 2 silos to get her through the winter and most of the way through the spring. Behind the silos, even in the dark, she knew what the hayfield looked like. Darker than the neighbors. Richer. Soil organic matter that had started at 1.1% and now sat at 1.6, heading for 2. She stood in the dark behind the dairy shed. The rain hit her hood. Her boots were soaked at the tops. The proof, she thought, is physical. It is not in the numbers on the kitchen table. It is here, in coats and in soil and in silence. She thought about Corwin. She thought about the way he had said the night before he died, "Waste Marin, look for the waste." She thought about how she had said, "I don't understand." She thought about how he had said, "You will." She thought, "All right, Grandpa, I understand." Then she thought one more thing. She thought it in a small, quiet voice inside her own head. She thought, "They are not going to take this from me. Not because of a policy memo in a corporate office in Louisville. Not because of a man in polished shoes with a clipboard full of paragraphs. Not tonight. Not ever." She went back to the house. By morning, the doubt was ash. And Marin did what Marin did. She worked the problem. She drove to the Harlan County Clerk's office at 8:30 the next morning. She spent 3 hours in a room that smelled like old carpet and toner cartridges, pulling Kentucky agricultural statutes off shelves and out of binders. She was polite. She was patient. She said please and thank you to the clerk who kept bringing her the volume she asked for. At 11:15, she found it, plain as day. Kentucky Revised Statutes Title 12, Chapter 257. Spent grain from brewing and distilling operations, when transferred directly to a farm operation for the purpose of animal feed, was classified as animal feed, not waste. It was exempt from waste disposal licensing requirements. Feed, not waste. Feed. Every dairy farmer and cattle operation in the state knew this. Every extension agent knew this. Redford Halstead's boss knew this, or should have. Redford Halstead himself had either not known it or not cared. Honestly, it did not matter which. She photocopied the relevant statute. She paid the clerk 15 cents for the copy. She thanked her. She drove home. She sat down at the kitchen table. She rolled a sheet of paper into Corwin's old Olivetti typewriter, the one that had sat on the desk in the corner of the parlor since 1968. The keys were stiff. The ribbon was going gray. She did not care. She typed one line. "Spent grain fed to livestock is feed, not waste. I'll need a receipt." She signed it. Marin Ashcroft. Underneath, in the same typewriter, she typed the address of Clearwater Brand's legal department in Louisville. She folded the letter. She stapled the photocopy of the statute to the back of it. She put both pages in an envelope. She addressed the envelope in her own hand. She drove to the post office in town. She sent it certified mail return receipt requested. The clerk at the post office window looked at the address on the envelope. She said, "Legal department, huh?" Marin said, "Yes, ma'am." The clerk gave her the return receipt slip. She said, "Well, good luck to you." Marin said, "Thank you." She drove home. 10 days later, the grain deliveries resumed. Dale Erickson showed up on a Tuesday like always. He backed the flatbed in. He clicked the silver pen twice. He tucked it behind his ear. He did not mention the legal letter. He did not mention Clearwater. He did not mention Redford Halstead with his polished shoes and his paragraphs. He just dumped the grain and left. And that silence, that conspicuous, deliberate silence, told you everything about how that conversation had gone in the Clearwater offices. Marin walked to the barn in the dark that night. She leaned against the doorframe. She listened to the cattle chewing in the quiet. And for the first time since Corwin's funeral, she felt the farm holding its weight beneath her instead of pulling her down. By 1995, the word had gotten out. Not because Marin told anyone, but because the numbers told themselves. That is the thing about cattle auctions. You can talk all you want at the co-op. You can lean against your truck at the feed store, and tell everyone how great your operation is running. But the auction house does not care about your story. It cares about weight. It cares about marbling. It cares about the grade stamped on the card when your animals walk through the ring. And Marin's cattle. Every single lot she brought through the Harlan County sale barn, that spring graded choice. Not select, not standard. Choice. Consistently. 3 sales in a row. Now the neighbors had been watching. They had been watching longer than they would ever admit. Tom Reddick, who ran 60 head on the ridge south of Marin's place, had his nephew pull the sale records. Quiet, you understand. Nobody wanted to be caught caring about what Corwin Ashcroft's granddaughter was doing with beer slop in a trench in the ground. But the numbers were right there in black ink. Marin's cost per pound of gain was sitting around 11 cents. County average 33. A third. She was putting weight on cattle for a third of what everyone else was spending, and the animals were grading higher while she did it. The laughter at co-op meetings stopped. Not all at once. It drained out slow, like water finding the low crack in a dam. First, the jokes got quieter. Then the jokes turned into silence. Then the silence turned into guys studying their coffee cups real hard whenever somebody mentioned spent grain or silage pH. Nobody said a damn word to Marin about it. Not yet. She did not need them to. She was already building. The second trench silo went up in the early summer of 1995. 40 feet long. She had already been using it for a year by then, since the summer of '94. But that spring, she added a proper concrete apron in front of it and a small drainage grate to handle the overflow when the deliveries came in heavier than she could pack in a single afternoon. The whole project cost her another $800. She paid cash. She kept the receipts in the same folder where she kept everything else. The new capacity doubled her ensiling volume to 4 tons per week. 4 tons. That is a serious volume of fermented feed sitting under plastic and tire weights. Quietly converting sugars to lactic acid. Quietly holding at a pH of 4.2. Quietly becoming the most efficient cattle ration in the county. And here is where the compounding really starts to show, not just in the cattle, but in the dirt beneath her boots. Her hay fields, the same fields she had been spreading manure on for 3 years running, tested that fall at 2.1% organic matter. When she had first jabbed Corwin's old steel soil probe into that ground 3 years prior, the number had been 1.1, 1.1 to 2.1. She had nearly doubled the life in that soil. Earthworm counts per cubic foot had tripled from around 4 to 12. Fat pink ropes threading through dark crumble that used to be pale and chalky as old ash. The hay was responding. She pulled 2.8 bales per acre off those fields that August against a county average of 1.8. A full bale more per acre. And the hay she did not need for her own cattle she sold. Another revenue stream. From beer slop that a brewery had been paying $75 a load to dump. Corwin had written it on page 41 of the leather journal. She knew the page by heart now. The brass clasp was worn smooth under her thumb from opening to it. Waste is just a resource without a destination. The old man had underlined it twice. 2 more breweries found her that autumn. Small operations, one in Bell County, one over in Leslie. Both drowning in the same problem Dale Erickson had tried to weaponize. Spent grain piling up. Disposal costs eating margins. Regulators sniffing around about runoff. They had heard through the strange grapevine of rural industry that some woman in Harlan County was taking the stuff and actually wanting it. Marin drove out to meet each of them. She negotiated the same terms she had set with Dale's outfit: free grain delivered to her gate or a paid disposal credit if volumes ran high enough to justify the trucking. No lawyers, no contracts thicker than a napkin, a handshake, a number, a schedule. She was formulating now, not just packing grain into a trench and hoping, actually formulating. Growing cattle got a different ratio than finishing cattle. Finishing animals needed more energy density, so she bumped the grain to hay proportion up, cut the dry matter content down to around 35%, packed it tighter. Animals being finished for market got the richest blend. heavier on the barley spent grain from the Leslie Brewery, which ran higher in residual protein than the wheat-based output from Bell County. She kept notes on everything. Meticulous, obsessive notes written in a second journal she had bought to match Corwin's. Same ruled pages, same binding, different ink. Her handwriting sat beside his now, blue beside black, granddaughter beside grandfather. And if you flip between the two books fast enough, the ideas blurred into one continuous thought stretched across decades. The system was working, every piece feeding the next. Grain became silage, silage became beef, beef became money, manure became soil, soil became hay, hay became feed and surplus income. The whole wheel turned on material that the world had called garbage. Then, on a Saturday morning in late October, Marin looked up from the second trench silo where she was checking the temperature of a fresh pack with a compost thermometer, making sure the anaerobic seal was holding. And she saw a familiar figure standing at her gate, June Calloway. Steel gray hair tucked behind her ears, maroon corduroy jacket buttoned against the chill, arms crossed the way they always were. Weight shifted to one hip, that dented tin thermos with the red plastic cap in her left hand, steam curling from the rim in the cold October air. The same woman who had stood in this yard 4 years ago and told Marin to sell the herd while she still could. Marin wiped her hands on her jeans. She walked across the yard slowly. She was not in a hurry to reach the gate. She wanted to give June time to say whatever she had come to say. June did not lead with small talk. She did not apologize. She did not explain herself. That is not how it works out here. A woman who spent 4 years thinking your grandfather was a fool and your operation was a foreclosure in progress does not walk up to your gate to say sorry. She walks up to your gate to ask a question. June said Marin. Marin said June. June looked at the two silos behind the dairy shed. She looked at the compost windrows steaming in the cold air. She looked at the herd in the south pasture coats already thickening for winter. She looked at the hay fields brown at the edges where the second cutting had come off 2 weeks before. She looked back at Marin. She said, "You got room to ensile an extra ton per week." That was the whole opening. She said, "I've got 22 head of my own. The feed bills are killing me. I heard you were taking spent grain from more than one brewery." I thought maybe. She did not finish the sentence. Marin looked at her for a long moment. June's face was set the way faces get set when a person is trying not to show that the asking has cost them something. Her jaw was tight. Her free hand was tucked deep in the pocket of the corduroy jacket. Her eyes were direct, but they were not proud. Marin opened the gate. She did not say anything. She walked June into the yard. She walked her to the second silo. She did not lead with words. She led with the work. She picked up a pitchfork that was leaning against the concrete wall. She handed it to June. She said, "Turn the north corner. I want to see how you do it." June took the pitchfork. She looked at Marin for a second. Then she looked at the silo. She stepped up to the north corner. She lifted a forkful. Marin said quiet, "Not like that. You don't dig. You lift and drop. Fold the crust back under. Air gets in. Pack stays warm. Ammonia never has a chance to build." June tried again. Slower. She got it the second time. Marin nodded once. She said, "That's it." She walked June to the mouth of the silo and she showed her the handful test. Grab a fistful. Close the hand. Open it. Good silage crumbles. Bad silage holds the shape of your hand. She showed her the moisture rule. She showed her the pH strips. She showed her the packing pattern with the tractor tires. She showed her the drainage channel Corwin had cut in 1961, still doing its job 34 years later. June listened. She did not interrupt. She did not ask a single question until Marin was done. Then she asked one, and it was the right one. She said, "What do I owe you?" Marin wiped her hands on her jeans. She looked at June. She said, "You'll owe me a fork turning and a full report. Come back in March. Tell me what your pack is doing." June looked at her. Her jaw worked. Something moved behind her eyes that had not moved in the 4 years Marin had known her. She said, "Marin, that's." She did not finish. Marin said, "Come back in March." June nodded. She handed the pitchfork back. She walked out through the gate. She got in her truck. She sat there for a moment before she started it. Then she started it and she drove home. By 1997, June Calloway's 22 head were also averaging 14% above county weight. By 1998, June had convinced her nephew, who ran 40 head north of the state road, to try the system. By 1999, there were 4 farms in Harlan County running some version of Marin Ashcroft's spent grain silage program. By the year 2000, there were 7. Let that sit for a second. 7 farms, 280 head of cattle collectively, chewing through silage blended from the output of 5 regional brewery partners. All of them coordinated informally through the same woman who had once been called a hobby by a man in a quarter-zip pullover in an office 11 miles east. June Calloway's 22 head had been the first to come on board. Once her animals started gaining weight through the winter on feed that cost her almost nothing, the whispers changed pitch. They stopped being jokes. They became questions. And then they became phone calls. Hesitant, a little embarrassed, always starting with, "June said you might be willing to talk about." Marin was always willing to talk. She just never talked much. The county extension office published a bulletin in the spring of 2001. 4 pages stapled photocopied on cream paper. It described the spent grain silage method in careful clinical terms: moisture content, fermentation duration, supplemental mineral ratios. It credited area producers for developing the practice. It did not name Marin, not once. But everyone in that county knew whose barn those measurements came from, whose trenches those pH readings were pulled out of, whose grandfather's journal held the original seed of the idea. The bulletin sat in a wire rack at the feed store next to pamphlets about commercial mineral blocks and slow-release nitrogen supplements. The same supplements Dale Erickson's people used to push at every county fair booth. Funny thing about institutional silence, it still echoes. Marin read the bulletin at the feed store counter on a Tuesday morning in April of 2001. She stood in the aisle. She read all 4 pages. She got to the end. She folded the bulletin in thirds. She put it in the inside left pocket of her canvas jacket, right next to the leather-covered journal. She did not say anything. The clerk at the feed store counter, a young man who had grown up in the county and knew who she was, watched her fold the bulletin. He watched her put it in her pocket. He rang up her oyster shell and her fencing staples without saying a word. She paid. She left. She had had practice. Here is what a decade of refusing the easy path actually looked like on paper. Between 1992 and 2001, Marin calculated her cumulative feed savings at $58,400. She did this at the kitchen table one February night, a cup of coffee going cold beside her. Corwin's journal opened to a page where he had written feed cost projections in 1979 that had turned out to be conservative. The back taxes, those ugly, suffocating back taxes that had nearly swallowed the farm whole, were long paid. Every fence post on the property was new cedar set in concrete. The barn had a standing seam metal roof that rang like a bell in a heavy rain. The equipment shed had a new door on hinges that did not sag. The tractor had a new alternator. The truck had a new belt. And the farm carried 0 debt. Not a dollar. Not a dime. No operating line. No equipment loan. No second mortgage. The land was hers, the way Corwin had always meant it to be, free and clear and answering to nobody. By her mid-30s, Marin moved through the property the way Corwin used to. You would have noticed if you had known them both. That same deliberate pace, one hand trailing along the fence rail or resting on a gatepost. Blue-gray eyes scanning not for problems, but for patterns. Her medium brown hair, still pulled back in that low ponytail with the same leather cord she had worn at 24, was starting to show threads of early silver at the temples. Just a few, catching the light when she turned her head. The freckles across her nose and cheekbones had deepened from years of sun. Her hands were harder, Her forearms were ropey with muscle, but the biggest change was something you could not photograph. She had stopped bracing for the next disaster. The farm had taught her to trust it. The next 20 years went by the way 20 years go by on a farm that works. Slow at first, then very fast. She bought the adjacent 40 acres from the Dawson brothers when they retired in 2011. She paid cash. She shook hands across a kitchen table. Bun Dawson, the elder brother, said only, "Corwin would be proud of you." Marin did not answer. She did not have to. By 2018, Marin Ashcroft was 51 years old. The silver threading through her ponytail was not hiding anymore. It had taken over the temples, completely streaking back in wide bands that made her look exactly like what she was. Someone who had been outside working for almost 3 decades. The farm was 280 acres now. From the air, and a university survey team did photograph it. From the air, Marin's land looked different from every property surrounding it. Darker, greener. The soil organic matter in her oldest fields tested at 3.4%. The county average hovered around 1.6. Her fields held water after a heavy rain while neighboring pastures sheeted off into the creek. The grass came back faster after grazing. The cattle were calm. The fences were tight. It was by every measure the agricultural world respected exceptional land, and it had been built from what a brewery threw away. Redford Halstead came back one time. It was in the summer of 2015, 22 years after his one and only visit. He was 60 years old by then. His face had softened in the way faces do when a man has spent a career in offices, and his shirt collar was tight in a way that suggested he had not bought a new size in a while. He drove a black Cadillac sedan up Marin's gravel drive at 3 in the afternoon. He did not get out. He sat in the driver's seat with the engine running. He looked at the 2 silos behind the dairy shed. He looked at the herd in the south pasture. He looked at the hayfield beyond the herd, which was darker green than any hayfield within 30 miles of it. He looked for maybe 2 minutes. Marin was on the porch. She was drinking coffee. She saw him. She did not stand up. He never got out of the car. After 2 minutes, he put the sedan in reverse. He backed down the gravel drive. He drove away. Marin watched him go. She took another sip of her coffee. She did not put the mug down for a long time. Later, she wrote in the journal, Halstead came back. Sat in a Cadillac at the end of the drive. 2 minutes. Didn't get out. Drove away. She looked at the entry. Then she wrote below it, he wasn't beaten. He was just no longer necessary. She closed the journal. That is the worst one when you have been on the other side of a Redford Halstead. It is not the anger. It is not the humiliation. It is being made to understand quietly in a Cadillac at the end of a driveway on a summer afternoon that the world you thought you controlled has moved on without you, and there is nothing left to argue about. 2 more years went by. 2. In September of 2018, a truck pulled up the gravel drive on a Tuesday morning. A young woman stepped out. She was 22. She had just finished at the State Agricultural College. She was carrying a duffel bag in a look that was equal parts determination and barely concealed terror. This was Linnea Ashcroft, Marin's grandniece, her older sister's granddaughter. She had grown up in Louisville. She had known Marin all her life the way a great niece knows a great aunt, which is to say at Thanksgiving dinners and the occasional summer weekend. She had studied animal science at the university. She had in her junior year sat in a lecture where the professor had made an aside about a woman in eastern Kentucky who had spent 40 years farming like it was 1910 and somehow could not go broke doing it. Linnea had written the name down in the corner of her notebook. She had left the lecture at the break. She had not gone back. She had finished her degree because her parents wanted her to. She had graduated in May. She had spent the summer thinking. And on a Tuesday morning in September, she had put a duffel bag in her truck, and she had driven 3 hours south to a 280-acre farm in Harlan County, Kentucky. And she had walked up to the porch and she had said, "Aunt Marin, I want to learn." Marin was on the porch when she pulled in. She was 51 years old. Her hair was almost entirely silver now, still pulled back in the low ponytail with the same leather cord she had worn at 24. Her face was lined at the corners of the eyes and along the mouth. She wore the same weathered tan canvas jacket, the same red and cream plaid flannel, the same medium blue jeans faded now to something closer to pale sky. The freckles were still there across the bridge of her nose. The blue-gray eyes were still direct. She stood up when Linnea got out of the truck. She did not hug her. She was not a hugger. She had never been. She looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. Marin poured 2 cups of coffee. Linnea sat with her hands wrapped around the mug and her eyes on the wood grain of the table. She did not speak first. Marin said, "What do you know?" Linnea said, "Not enough." Marin said, "That's the right answer." They sat there a moment. Then Marin reached down to the pocket of her canvas jacket that was hanging on the back of the chair. She pulled out the leather-covered journal. Corwin's journal. The one that had ridden in her breast pocket for 27 years. The brass clasp was worn smooth. The leather was soft as old cloth. The corners had gone dark and rounded from decades of handling. She set it on the table, between them. She said, "This belonged to my grandfather. He wrote in it for 50 years. I've been writing in it for 27. There is a second one now. I keep it in the drawer. I'll show it to you tomorrow." Linnea looked at the journal on the table. She did not touch it. She was smart enough not to touch it yet. Marin said, "Start at the beginning. Don't skip the failures. The failures are the whole book." 6 words, a whole philosophy. Linnea looked up. She said, "How long do I stay?" Marin said, "As long as you want. As long as the work holds you. When you know, you'll know." Linnea nodded, slow. She looked at the journal again. She said, "Aunt Marin, can I ask one thing?" Marin said, "Go ahead." Linnea said, "Why me?" Marin looked at her for a long moment. She said, "Because you drove down. Nobody drove down for me. I had to figure it out alone. You don't." She said it flat, not as a complaint, as a fact. Then she said, "Now, go look at the silage trench. Come back and tell me what you see." Linnea stood up. She picked up the journal. She held it carefully with both hands the way you would hold a bird. She walked out of the kitchen. Marin heard the screen door open and close, heard the boots on the porch, heard the boots on the gravel going slow in the direction of the dairy shed. Marin sat at the kitchen table for a moment. She poured herself another cup of coffee. She did not follow yet. She wanted to give Linnea time to arrive. That evening at sundown, Linnea sat on the porch steps. She had opened the journal. She was reading. Marin was leaning against the porch post in the faded canvas jacket, the cream thermal Henley visible underneath at the collar. She was drinking a second cup of coffee, gone cold now. Linnea read the first line aloud. Her voice was uncertain but steady. "Waste is just a resource without a destination." She read it again, to herself this time, silently. Marin said, "That is the whole book when you get down to it." Linnea said, "It sounds simple." Marin said, "It is simple. That is the trick. The world spends a lot of money making simple things look complicated so it can charge you for the complication." Linnea looked at her. Her jaw was set the way jaws get set when a young person is deciding whether to trust something. Marin said, "You'll see it in the silage tomorrow. You'll see it in the compost the day after. You'll see it in the hayfields next spring. And in 5 years, you will look at the world differently than you look at it now. You will start seeing waste everywhere. You will start seeing failed destinations. You will start seeing what is missing. And when you see it, you will not be able to stop seeing it. And that is when the work becomes yours." Linnea was quiet. Marin looked out at the pasture. The cattle were moving across it in the last light. Broad-shouldered, glossy, calm. Marin said, "Come look at this." Linnea stood up. She walked over to the porch rail. Marin held out the journal to her. Linnea took it. Marin said, "Turn to the back." Linnea turned to the back. There were maybe 40 blank pages left. Corwin's handwriting had filled the first 180. Marin's had filled the next 130. There was space for one more hand or maybe two before the book ran out. Marin said, "Those pages are yours." Linnea looked at her. She said, "Aunt Marin, I don't." She did not finish. Marin said, "You don't have to earn it. You just have to fill it. Write down what you learn. Write down the failures, especially the failures. Someday you will hand this to somebody, and the failures will be the part they need most." Linnea held the journal against her chest. She did not say anything. She did not have to. The sun was gone off the ridge now. The first stars were coming out. The wind that had turned Marin's cheeks pink for almost 30 years was moving through the pasture grass, the same as it had moved through it in December of 1991, the same as it would move through it for however many Decembers were left. Marin buttoned the top button of the canvas jacket against the cold. She looked at Linnea one more time. Then she said, "All right, come on, I'll show you where the pH strips are kept." She turned. She walked toward the barn. Linnea Ashcroft stood on the porch a moment longer. She looked down at the journal in her hands, Corwin's handwriting on the left page, Marin's handwriting on the right, and 40 blank pages waiting at the back for a third hand. She opened the journal to the middle, to an entry from January of 1992 in the young hand of a 24-year-old woman still leaning left before it started leaning right. Lost 1 ton to mold, 2 tons left, silo ready, packing tomorrow at first light, 21 days. Below that in the same young hand underlined once, waste is just a resource without a destination. Linnea read it once, then she read it again. She pulled the corner of her sleeve across her eyes because she was alone on the porch and there was no reason not to. And she closed the journal and she held it against her chest and she followed her great Aunt Marin across the yard toward the barn. The lantern was already lit by the door. Marin was ahead of her walking with her hands in the pockets of the canvas jacket's silver ponytail catching the last blue light. She did not turn around. She did not have to. She knew Linnea was there. Outside, the wind was picking up. The stars were coming out clean over the ridge. In 280 acres of eastern Kentucky land that had been called worthless by a bank in 1962, in a foreclosure in progress by an operations manager in 1991, sat quiet in the dark and waited for morning. The story beats its way home. Not the joke this time, not the punchline, something else, a quieter thing. That waste is a resource without a destination. That broken is not always broken. That the loudest man in the room is often the one who understands the least of what he is looking at. That silence starves a mockery. That a receipt is not a small thing. That a warm hand on the back of your neck when you are 10 years old is a promise made in a language a child cannot translate. That will come back to you 30 years later in the middle of a Kentucky winter and tell you exactly what to do. And that sometimes the answer to a question the whole county is laughing at is standing right there in front of you. 3 tons of it, steaming in the December air, waiting for somebody to see it for what it is. 3 tons of spent grain, $0. And a young woman in a canvas jacket in a wind that turned her cheeks pink, who did not blink much, who asked for a receipt, and who spent